it's an honor. Please.
Yeah, thank you very, very much, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. And it's true, I'm really a little bit worried of leaving my phone somewhere in my bag, because you never know whether another country will have attacked another country, and everything that I want to tell you is already obsolete again. And I guess that tells us a little bit already about the theme that we are discussing this afternoon. But let me, where is it? Doesn't seem to work yet. There we go. Let's talk about the state of global peace and trade, and this is what I would like to discuss with you. First of all, I would like to go, well, more or less over the globe and see what kind of conflicts we are currently observing. And I would like to highlight to you that the conflicts in Ukraine and in Gaza and also in Iran are just the tip of the iceberg. It's the conflicts that we are discussing the most, that are publicly most widely perceived, but it's not the most brutal or the most worrying conflicts, maybe even. Then I would like to talk about that they highlight a deeper development that we see globally, and we can term that development polarization. We usually talk about polarization within our societies, that the possibility of finding compromise on controversial issues is decreasing by the day. Well, this is happening internationally as well, and I would like to highlight what kind of effect it has on international institutions, on conflicts, and also on trade. Thirdly, we cannot have this discussion without talking about the new Trump administration, and we'll go into that as well. Before then, I finally close with giving at least some ideas on how one could steer the course in these uncertain times. Let's talk about the state of global peace and the current conflict with geopolitical magnitude. And these are, of course, the conflicts in Ukraine and in the Middle East, and I will be very brief on that. We are in the 4th year of the Russian aggression against Ukraine. Ukraine has come under enormous pressures on the Eastern Front. We see increasing bombings by the Russians of infrastructure and also of civilians. We don't see any kind of willingness by the Russian side to make concessions, but rather reiteration of its more radical positions on how this conflict should end. Trump, on the other hand, is about to sideline Europe, and he refuses to put pressure on Putin. So, from all we know by now, we have to say that this war is probably to stay with us for quite some time. If we turn into the Middle East, and this is probably the conflict where we all want to check our iPhones every 30 minutes to see whether the truce holds, we have not only the continuing war in Gaza since October 2023, we also see an extension of Israel's military operations in the West Bank. We see the support for new settlements, and by the way, we don't see any kind of peace plans or any plans for a day after. Israel and later also the United States have attacked Iran, and we have seen a possible truce this morning after 12 days of war, but we have also seen violations of this truce already during this day, and these were the changes that I had to make to the presentation. So there is a truce, there's no truce, maybe there is one. We have another truce in the region. That's a truce that the US has made with the Houthis in Yemen. And this truce might also fail. Actually, the Houthis have already said that they do not feel compelled by the truce. In general, for the whole region, for the whole conflict situations that we have, there is no strategy by the parties. The region remains a major conflict hotspot, and Israel's aims with regard to Iran and beyond are uncertain. And this is the war on the wall that everybody's speculating about. This is, of course, Taiwan. And China here remains committed to the reunification with Taiwan. Xi has demanded that his military is ready to take Taiwan back one way or the other by 2027, and it has exerted an enormous military build-up. In the region, it has increased its military maneuvers, also with specialized utilities for taking Taiwan back, and we see a military build-up actually on all sides. So also the US and its allies do that in the region. As I said, this is the tip of the iceberg. This is beyond the surface. The war in Sudan, and I haven't listed the war in South Sudan, actually. There's also a conflict going on there. The war in Sudan is the most dramatic that we currently observe. The famine that it has caused affects about 25 million civilians. We have 4 million refugees right now. Then we have the conflicts in the Sahel zone. Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, they have all experienced recent military coups, at times more than one military coup. And all of the military governments that have come into place are aligned with Russia. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, one of our most long-standing conflict areas in Africa, we have seen that Uganda has once again supported a rebel organization, the so-called M23, which makes progress into the DRC. The UN remains paralyzed. Venezuela, we've seen election fraud and aggression against Guyana. Actually, Venezuela has announced that it plans or even has already annexed a region of Guyana where there is a lot of gas and oil. India, Pakistan, we see a fragile truce. We don't know how stable it will be. North Korea, South Korea, tensions are at a historic high. Armenia, Azerbaijan, no progress towards a peace accord because Azerbaijan doesn't commit to the peace process, and this is because Russia doesn't have any interest in seeing a peace accord. Serbia, Kosovo, Bosnia, we have seen tensions rising during the late years. This is just a list of some of the more dramatic conflicts that we see, or conflicts with a potential. And if you look at this, you can see that I think I've listed all world regions that we can think of. What does that have to do with increasing polarization? I would say it is one effect of an increasing polarization that we can see. And I would like to highlight this polarization in two issue areas with you: peace and security, and then, of course, I will talk about trade. If we're looking at peace and security, what do we mean? We have the collective security in the UN system, that is the prohibition on the use of violence, and of course also the ways that the UN might exert violence itself. And then it is about arms control and international humanitarian law, so the rules of war making. If we look at arms control in nuclear terms, there is not much left. So bilateral treaties have been cancelled already, or they need renewal, and no party, that means Russia or the US, is showing any willingness to renew these treaties. START, INF, or the ABM treaties, these are all nuclear arms control treaties, and they are all going to the ashes. With regard to multilateral treaties, we have, of course, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which is still in place, but it's stagnating. Why? Because the nuclear weapon states that have committed to disarm do exactly the opposite. They rearm and they modernize their nuclear arsenals. With regard to conventional weapons, so all weapons that are non-nuclear, we have a complete decay in Europe. There is nothing left on the European soil. We have treaties that have come under severe pressure. The prohibition of the use of anti-personnel landmines. Several European countries just have declared that they will leave that treaty. Why? Because they feel threatened by Russia and want to use this weapon again. The same holds for cluster ammunition, another prohibited, another banned weapon type. And with regard to chemical weapons, you might all recall major violations by Syria some years ago, and also some rumors about the use of chemical weapons within Ukraine, or rather in the Ukraine war. Looking into international humanitarian law, compliance with these laws has systematically decreased, and we see it in all conflicts. We see it in Ukraine, we see it in Gaza, we see it in Sudan, we see it actually everywhere. And the difference to earlier times is that nobody thinks it's even necessary to justify these violations anymore. And this is even supported by a general friend-foe logic going on in international humanitarian law. Think about, for instance, our new chancellor who has said one has to be able to invite Prime Minister Netanyahu of Israel to Germany, even though Germany is a state party to the International Criminal Court, and will be forced, will be compelled actually to arrest Netanyahu when he enters Germany. We've seen similar reactions with regard to the International Court of Justice in its ruling on the Gaza military strategy of Israel, and we see it again in the war of Israel against Iran. It is, for everything else it is as well, but it is a war of aggression, and it is a violation of international law. No matter whether we think there are very good reasons to enter into this war, it is an aggression. But what we see is that states begin to think about who's a friend, who's not a friend, who's an enemy, who's a friend, when they judge whether something is legal or illegal and whether they want that to matter. And this is, of course, a problem, because whenever you begin to say the law is only applicable to some states and not others, then it doesn't matter for any state in the end. And then coming to the core, collective security within the UN. We have a massive polarization in the UN Security Council, an all-time high. Vetoes, since 2010, we have seen 48 vetoes. 5 of those were from the Western countries with a veto position, that is the UK, France, or the United States. 42 have been issued by China and Russia. With regard to UN peacekeeping missions, we have seen no new mission since 2013. But I've shown you the list of some of the more dramatic conflicts. The number and gravity of international conflicts have increased in that time. But we don't see any new peacekeeping mission issued. China and Russia have actually begun to cooperate to constrain peacekeeping missions. That is, they have begun to constrain budgets, they have begun to close down human rights missions and stuff like that. And this means that many of these peacekeeping troops do not have the personnel or the budget to even fulfill their mandate, because they have to stay within their headquarters in the conflict area. That doesn't mean that there is less of military interventions. It only means they do not happen within the United Nations or authorized by the United Nations, but they are taking place outside of that regulation. We see states doing it on their own. Think about France in their former colonies. Think about coalitions of the willing between the US, UK, stuff like that. So all this is happening, actually. And we see open violations of the prohibition on the use of force as well, as I just highlighted. So coming to nicer areas, let's talk about trade and how it looks like for trade in the world right now. Well, not that much better, actually, but we see a very similar picture. So the free trade system is basically failing by now. If we look at the World Trade Organization, which is somehow the most important organization in that area, we don't see any significant progress with regard to rules, free trade rules, since the failed Doha round. Hardly 40% of member states comply with regulations anymore. That doesn't sound too good, does it? We see an increase of unilateral trade policies. Think about the European Union, who does that very often. We see bilateral and minilateral trade agreements as a substitute for the WTO, and partly already deviating from WTO regulations. And we see, and I've brought here a picture, a continuing increase of tariffs and non-tariff trade barriers. And if I would have numbers with, of course, Trump too, that would probably not fit on that sheet anymore, because you would see an explosion. So what happens with regard to the real trade on the ground if this kind of trend goes on, if polarization keeps at this high? And I think these two graphs make that very clear. On the one hand, we see that geopolitical risk assessments are at a high, and they remain at that high, if you think about what I just told you about trade. about conflicts. Then look at the trade and investment pictures that we have. These are data from the International Monetary Fund, where we can see that trade begins to follow political alignments. So these are numbers actually from 2022. And so we are still in a phase where trade is trying to recover. And look where it recovers the most, actually within bloc, and these blocs are voting blocs within the United Nations, so it's the West and its friends. Then you have kind of an Eastern bloc, China, Russia, Nicaragua, and some other states about BRICS. And then you have the usual non-alignment. And if you look at this, you can see that trade follows bloc. The most recovery turns out within bloc, the least recovery between blocs, and then somehow in the middle position is with the non-aligned. And if we're looking at foreign direct investments, it's a pretty similar picture. We see more recovery within bloc, less recovery between blocs, and logically we see here positive values for investments in the non-aligned, because it seems to be kind of a safe haven. What has happened with regard to that? So how do states and how do businesses react to these kind of patterns that are highlighted to you? So economically, even though everyone talks about decoupling, we don't see decoupling on the ground. We don't see it by companies, and particularly not in Europe with regard to China. Investments into China remain at a robust level. There's not much fluctuation actually going on. We see that only 1/3 of companies have a China strategy in place as of 2025. And only about 40% have exit strategies in place, like China Plus One or carve-out strategies. Politically, the situation is a little bit different. So here we have states who are trying to become more proactive in asking businesses to align with their political goals. So we see export limitations. We see, for instance, increase in insurance rates if you do not comply with certain ideas that governments have. And we see support for friend and nearshoring strategies. We see that progressive agendas lose support with regard to sustainability, with regard to CSR. So particularly by the Trump administration, but not only actually, but by the Trump administration, it does everything it can in the different sectors to make companies comply with its banning of DEI, for instance. We see new formats, such as BRICS Plus, going on, who can increase their influence, and we see global competition increasing, not only with regard to arms and arms procurement, but also with regard to infrastructure. And this has come into two more or less cohesive blocks, the Belt and Road Initiative on the one hand, and the Global Gateway Initiative by the European Union. But guess who is heading this race? It is not the Global Gateway Initiative at that point in time. But what we see here is that there is a political will to increase polarization, not to decrease it. If that all has already happened, this is all before Trump 2 actually. What happened with Trump 2? Well, as I said, polarization increases in all democracies, wherever you come from, in Europe or the United States, you can see an increasing polarization. So there is this tendency of an increase of political support at the political margins and a lack of compromise in between the camps that arise from that. Associated with this increase, and we have numerous studies on that, is skepticism towards international cooperation. That is, whenever you have a polarized system, what you see is that there is a lack of international engagement. And it's in particular true, more intense, when you have right-wing populists who are entering into government responsibility. And Trump is probably the prime example for that. So you see a highly polarized United States society with a right-wing politician who has come into power, and he not only wins because he exploits this polarization, but he fuels it also domestically and internationally as well. So what does that mean internationally? Because this is my area of expertise. Well, this is just, again, a list of the most dramatic and most recent decisions. Termination of programs of US aid. So this is the development assistance, humanitarian aid. It's all gone to the ashes. Exit the World Health Organization, followed by Argentina. The Paris Agreement, the UN Human Rights Council, Israel follows. UNESCO is under scrutiny, sanctioning the ICC, and these are just some of the more well-known decisions taking. We see punitive tariffs towards China, Canada, Mexico, EU, and then they were global. That was this, you may remember this, Freedom Day. We have Panama threatening with military force, Denmark threatening with military force, Gaza, the Riviera of the Middle East, minerals deal with Ukraine, cooperation with Putin, 5% NATO contributions or we're out, and Vance's infamous talk on the Munich Security Conference, Europe might not be worth defending. What are the effects of this kind of policy? And I guess we will talk a little bit about the creative effects of disruption. And this is disruptive, what we've seen. Well, the pressure that Trump uses will work in the short run, and we see that. There are trade deals being negotiated right now with China, from all we know. Just a reminder, the last deal with China, following pressure by Trump, the Phase 1 agreement, had zero effect. In fact, looking at trade flows afterwards, China did import less US products than before, but that's just another story. Nevertheless, in the long run, what states will do, they will engage in de-risking towards the United States. And we see that already happening, that states are turning towards China, for instance, to have more of a flexibility and become less dependent on the US. Polarization pressure will increase, but not in favor of Europe or the West, but in favor of other regions in the world and other political systems and ideologies. Economically, risks and fragmentation will stay with us because there are no counter forces at that moment that we could report on. Trade conflicts with the US will stay, and as will probably the higher tariffs. That is, there is no scenario where we could come back to the tariffs from before Trump 2, but we will see that we have a new plateau from which we start when we're talking about tariffs. And most astonishingly, the US will probably carry the highest costs in the long run because it will vastly lose influence. And you can see that already. If you just look at Israel's decision to attack Iran, that was not in consultation with Trump, it was notifying Trump that it will do that. And this is a complete change of forces compared to earlier times. And this happens in many other sectors and with many other actors as well. So, I guess by now you're a little bit depressed or frustrated. I'm trying to get back into a more positive, optimistic mood. Let's see how to steer the course in these uncertain times. Well, still a little bit more depressing. This new administration of Trump 2, it is not frustrated with Europe. It is not frustrated with European NATO states not, committing to a 2% goal or now to a 3.5% goal. That's not the issue. It is also not frustrated with the rules-based international order and that some states rather exploit the order than comply by it. It despises them. It despises Europe and the European Union, and it despises the rules-based order. There is a different ideology in place in this administration that doesn't think that Europe or the rules-based order is worth upholding. Think about it. Threatening close allies, punishing allies, sidelining allies, alignment with Putin, indicating military disengagement from Ukraine, and actually also Europe, although nobody wants to talk about that publicly, but they are doing that. It means rejecting the rules-based order and instead opting for a power-based order. What does that mean? Well, now I'm coming to the positive side of things. Finally, Europe has no alternative anymore. It has to do something. It has to do something, and that is it has to manage its defense on its own. And one would say even its destiny on its own. And we see that there is something going on. So we have the Euro Plus model. What we see is something that Schäuble dreamt of. The Europe of variable speed, and I would say of variable geography as well. This is not the European Union that we see now, but it will be a different political union that will probably be apparent during the next years or decade. Defense and security, we see the group of five, we see the coalition of the willing. These are all kind of labs, real-life labs, where these new formats, these new geographies are being tested, so something is going on. Europe's economy relies on a rules-based order. We need access to markets, to pre-products, and of course also to critical resources, and we see this with the raw ores right now. What do we have to do? The majority of states shares this interest. They are also relying on this kind of rules-based order, particularly in Asia, but also in Latin America. These are the regions where we find partners to uphold the core rules and the core institutions that we rely on. But it also means we need to relax our hopes for more, this deeper integration, more sophisticated institutions. We should forget about that. We can have that in Europe, but we cannot have it globally. De-risking for Europe, as for many other states, will mean midterm de-risking against the US, becoming less dependent, becoming more flexible. That doesn't mean that we will turn towards China, so don't get me wrong. Europe needs to strengthen its economy, yes, that's sure. Investments in infrastructure, resource shoring, education, research, blah, blah, blah. The issue is, Europe needs to find a niche. It has been delayed in many, many areas. So it needs to find its own niche right now. Key industries, technologies need to be identified and supported. And I guess green technologies are one of these potential niches. And that means also sustainability might be part of one of these niches. Economically, higher tariffs are going to stay. Geopolitical risks are going to stay. We live in volatile times and it will not end anytime soon. That means for companies, they need to de-risk. They need globalization approaches, produce local for local. They have to make conservative plans with regard to investments. They have to project longer-term investments to compensate for high volatility. They have to prepare for exit strategies, carve out China plus one, plus one, and of course, also with regard to the US, they have to keep flexible and increase storage capacities, and they have to partner with governments to come together to use sustainability as a strategy to allow for market access to others, for instance. That would be one strategy to keep, in a time where all companies and governments feel pressured to lower standards, to keep standards an advantage in competition, not a disadvantage. Thank you.